This occurrence finds me in good old Ohio. You see, I was on hiatus from life in general at the time, debating a fresh start in a new corner of the country. I'd been in Ohio before, though only for a short time, and my memories of it were quite fond. I decided to go back there and see if I still felt the same way about it. I wasn't employed at the time, but I had a substantial source of income due to the fact that I do tattoo work. It was that work that allowed me to rent an extended stay motel room for the time being, and was unfortunately also the reason that this encounter came to pass. I'm going to cover this now to save questions later. I'm not a licensed tattoo artist, though that is soon to be changing. But I certainly wasn't licensed at this time and in this state. I am, however, a very good artist with excellent sanitation practices, as 2 people in my life are professionally licensed artists, and they taught me everything that I know. Back to this story. I got a text from somebody who had seen a post about my work. She said her name was Kimberly, and she was interested in getting something done. We talked a bit and compared schedules, all that fun stuff. We were a bit at odds with our timing and decided that I would meet her at her job to further discuss it, and so she could also see my portfolio. Kimberly worked at a small deli, not too far from my motel, so I headed over there at the appointed time. It seemed as if the deli was empty, with only a single car in the lot other than mine. I grabbed my equipment, went inside, and the little bell at the door dinged. That's when a little Asian man came out to the counter and asked me how he could help me. I said that I was looking for Kimberly and explained that I had business with her. He said, "Sure, hold on," before stepping out into the lobby area of the deli. Then he went over to the front door, pulled out his keys, and locked it. At this point, I personally couldn't have left without the key. It was needed to get out and to get in. Then he turned to me and he told me that he was Kimberly, and he asked me to sit down. I reached into my pocket for my phone and realized that I had left it in my car. That's when I went to the door and tried it anyway, and unsurprisingly, it wouldn't open. The whole time, Kimberly is just staring at me with a smile. He asked me again to sit down, so I did. I asked him plainly, why'd he lock me inside? And he stated that it was for our safety. I gave him the benefit of the doubt. He looked harmless, and we were in a bad part of town. He started talking about the tattoo, asking questions. He wanted to know if I could do portrait work, and I explained that I could, and that some of my portrait work was shown in the post that he'd gotten my info from. He said he needed 7 faces and wanted it to be a whole sleeve. This was beyond the scope of anything we discussed, and I told him it could be done, but it would take a while, and it would have to be more than 1 session. This seemed to make him uncomfortable. He asked how long, and I said that I didn't know. It's hard to estimate portrait work, as each picture presents its own unique challenges. He asked how many sessions it would take again, and I said ideally 1 for each face, but that I might be able to do 2 at a time. Then I asked him who the people were, if they were family, friends, lost loved ones. But he didn't answer me right away. He just got this spacey look in his eyes and seemed to stare right through me. After a while, he did start talking. The first one he wanted, he said, was a woman he'd known in high school. I found it strange the way that he said it. Like, you don't just get casual acquaintances' portraits on you. You just don't. So I asked why he wanted her tatted on him, and without batting an eyelash, he told me that it was because she had been his first kill. I sat there in disbelief. Didn't even know what to say. Was this a bad joke? Was he waiting to get a reaction out of me? But then he started talking again after a few moments. He said that all of the people he wanted portraits of were people who he had dispatched from this life. He also said that he'd killed more than that, many more, but that these were his favorite ones. I didn't know whether or not to believe him, but given the situation I was in, I didn't really want to find out. I asked him why I should tat these people on him when he'd probably just kill me afterwards too, and he looked legitimately surprised at this question. He told me that he'd never even considered it, which I found odd, especially given that he's told me his story and that I knew where he worked. He went on to tell me some really horrific things about what he'd done, things that I won't share here. He gave me names and locations, and was going to give me pictures of his victims for the tattoos. He said that before long, he would get caught, and he wanted these tats on his arms so that he'd never forget their faces while he was in prison. I don't think that this man felt that I could be any kind of threat to him. He was just so casual about everything that he said. Wasn't even really defensive in the least. But I grew up in the hood and had done several years in prison. I personally knew how to handle myself. But I didn't even really need to know how, as it turned out, because I stood up, hit him once, and he fell to the floor, seeming to be unconscious. I removed the key from his pocket, unlocked the door, ran to my car, before leaving in a hurry. I called the police to report everything as I drove off. And this is where it gets really scary. They dispatched officers to the deli and sent one to my motel room so I could file a report about everything I was told. The officer that showed up looked puzzled when I told him where it had happened. He asked if I was sure. I said that I was, and he told me that that deli had been closed for a few weeks now because the owner had disappeared. The owner's family apparently believed that the owner had gone to Hawaii for whatever reason. I guess he'd told them before that he was thinking about it, but he hadn't been in touch, so they had reported him missing. I told the officer that I was sure about where I was and that I had proof. Hell, I still had the keys to the place. The cop went pale, looked pretty disturbed at this admission, but wouldn't say anything more about it. I gave him the keys, and he left. Apparently, when the police showed up at the deli, they found it unlocked and empty, absolutely void of any clue that there was an unconscious person lying there just a few minutes before. Later on, though, through means that I can't really mention here, I found out a few things that were pretty disturbing to me. One of them was that the owner's family hadn't been able to access the deli at all because it was locked up, and they had told the police that the owner had been the only person with the keys. I never heard anything more about this, but I did a little investigating of my own. I searched all of the names that he had told me about and got a few things from it. I can't be certain of these things as they were unrelated to what happened, but I got hits on two of the names. The first was a sex worker who had several arrests on her record due to her line of work. The arrests weren't in this area, but they hadn't been too far away either. The second was a similar story, but several drug charges instead of prostitution. And just like the other, she wasn't in the area, but she wasn't far off either. No hits for missing people under those names at all, but a sex worker might not have anyone who would have reported them missing. Same with a woman who was caught up in narcotics. That, or the people who would possibly report her missing, assumed she was on a using binge somewhere and neglected to file a report. I found nothing at all about the rest of the names that I was given. I don't know what to believe about all of this, but I lean towards the possibility that this guy was dead serious. His demeanor, that vacant stare of his, him locking the deli up, his behavior practically screamed that something was wrong. I left Ohio very shortly after this happened, went home, and I haven't returned since. The story I'm about to share involves an active criminal case. I'm going to keep a few of the details vague because I don't want to do anything that might cause this bastard to get off with anything less than what he deserves: life in prison, if not the needle. This happened a few years back, close to Christmas time. I work from home and have since the early 2000s. At the time, I was renting a house in a blue-collar, middle-class neighborhood. One day, my son, who was in high school at the time, woke up with a raging headache, so I let him stay home from school. It was mid-morning when my doorbell rang. That itself wasn't unusual. The neighborhood where we lived was kind of a prime spot for door-to-door solicitors, Jehovah's Witnesses, and the like. I yelled for my son to get it because he was so much better at getting rid of those types. No joke, the kid has this deadpan stare that would make even the devil flinch. Being that he was on it, I just moved on to my next task, pretty much forgot about it. That is, until later that night. I asked my son who it was at the door. He responded with, "The landscaper." I asked, "Gary?" That seemed odd. Gary lived across the street from me and ran his own landscaping business. He only came over once in the winter to do some basic maintenance, and he'd actually just done that the weekend before. My kid was quick to correct me though. "No, the other one. I think it's his son." That was even weirder. Gary's stepson had moved in with him over the summer. I'd like to claim that my instincts were strong enough to know that something was off with the dude, but honestly, I barely even knew he existed. Sometimes he would help Gary do my yard, but for the most part, we never even spoke. Him coming to the door didn't make any sense at all. Well, what did he want? My son shrugged it off. He didn't say. As soon as I opened the door, he just said sorry, walked back down the stairs, and left. While I found that odd, my first thought was, well, if it's something important, he'll come back. This didn't come off as anything too concerning. From what I did know of Gary's stepson, he was awkward. Like, no eye contact, grunting a hello awkward. I gave a passing thought to going over to Gary's to see what he needed, but decided not to bother. It all seemed so innocuous. It wouldn't be until a few months later that I learned that it was anything but. I can't remember exactly how long after it happened, but it was probably less than a week before I got another knock on my door. Again, early in the morning. This time my son was at school, so I answered it. It was a police officer standing on my porch. They were canvassing the neighborhood looking for a woman who'd gone missing. She'd gone out for a jog a few days previous and had never come back home. The police were asking pretty much everyone on our route if they'd seen anything. I looked at a picture of this woman, didn't recognize her, and let the officer know that. I never even thought about the weird visit from Gary's son because, honestly, who on earth would have connected the two? They eventually found the missing woman's body a few weeks later. I learned about that on the news. Her body was left in a county burn pile, the kind that landscapers in my area use to dispose of yard waste. That bit of information is how they traced it back to my landscaper's stepson. About a month after they found her body, Gary's stepson was arrested. I didn't learn about the arrest until I got another knock on the door. This time, it was a detective. He was following up because during the stepson's confession, he'd admitted that the woman jogger was a victim of opportunity. He'd seen her running past his house. It had been around 11 a.m. and no one was around because it was a weekday and most people in our neighborhood were at work or at school. So he chased her down and abducted her. He'd also informed the detective that he'd planned to kill a woman that day. Problem was, when he went to his original target's home, her 6-foot-tall, 230-pound teenage son answered the door instead. Realizing that trying to confront the kid would get his ass handed to him, he just went back home, where he waited on the porch for a while, hoping that the kid would leave so that he could try again. That's when he saw the jogger. While the detective was talking, I was detached in a, "why are you telling me all of this" kind of way. That's when I remembered the weird visit from the landscaper's son, and I realized then that I was the target he was talking about. If my son hadn't stayed home, hadn't answered the door that day, I would have been the woman they pulled out of that brush pile. My son's testimony became pretty important. It was used to show that the landscaper's son wasn't nuts when he committed the crime, as he was logical enough to plan out a murder. He just didn't get to kill the person that he wanted to, that person being me. I still have a lot of guilt about everything that happened. First, because I put my son in front of a cold-blooded killer. If that killer wasn't a pussy who only went after people weaker than him, that day could have gone way different. Second, because some other lady technically died in my place. Logically, I know it wasn't my fault, but on that emotional, non-logical level, I feel terrible because I know if I'd opened the door that day, that lady would still be alive. This just goes to show that what we think of as small decisions in the moment can have absolutely devastating ramifications down the line. Not my story, but my father's. Around 40 years ago, when my dad was still in college, he moved quite a ways away from his hometown of Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, to New Haven, Connecticut for college. He wanted to be as near as possible to his school, but he also wanted to overlook the city skyline. He had already received his documentation and went to the Vietnam consulate at the US Embassy to try to get an M student visa. He was a first-generation immigrant, and though he had taken a fair amount of English classes in Vietnam, he wasn't fluent and knew nothing about housing in America. This is why he went the cheap route and rented out a podunk apartment somewhere near Pine Tree Drive in West Haven. His landlord, as he told me later, gave off some serious red flags that my dad sort of brushed off because the apartment was only $250 a month. Firstly, the landlord's unit was directly next door to that of my dad's. And during my father's first night there, while he was getting unpacked, he heard some strange, high-pitched screeching and weird opera music coming from next door. Again though, he brushed it off. But the next morning when he awoke, he noticed a chair by his bed that hadn't been there before. And when he went to the bathroom, the seat was up, though he recalled putting it down. Now, those two things would be odd on their own, but add in that his front door was unlocked. Again, my father brushed it off because he didn't want to stir up anything with his landlord by asking if the landlord had come into his room, or by asking if the apartment had been broken into, therein referring to the fact that the apartment may not be secure. My father also wanted to explore West Haven, as his college year didn't begin until late August. He had come a few weeks early. As he left the apartment, he specifically remembered locking his door behind him. But when he returned later that afternoon, he noticed that not only had the door been unlocked, but it was left slightly ajar. This weirdness went on for weeks until the college semester began. Things slightly moved from where he had left them, articles of food missing from his fridge, and other weird happenings as well. Finally, my dad had had enough. One night, he decided to stay awake until very late in an attempt to try to catch whoever was doing this red-handed. That night, he finished his homework, got into bed, but remained awake. Sure enough, at around 2 a.m, he sees his door handle turning. Then, a hand sliding through. My dad froze, all the while his blood running cold. He then saw the landlord creep in and take some eggs from the fridge. Not only that, but the landlord then went to the bathroom, coming out a couple of minutes afterward. He slipped out once again, leaving the door unlocked. This creeped my dad out like hell, which is understandable, but for some stupid reason, he still decided to stay at the apartment for a few more nights before he finally confronted the landlord. Money and wanting to save it does some stupid things to the brain, I guess. This all happened before mobile phones, and even decent cameras back then cost upwards of $100. So my dad had literally no way to get evidence to show the cops, beside mere accusations. The next night, he once more heard that odd screeching and weird opera music coming from his landlord's room. That's when he decided to take matters into his own hands. That weekend, when his landlord went out shopping, my father broke into his landlord's room. What he found there was seriously f***ing disturbing. First of all, the landlord had some weird sex doll, just out and about for display. But when my father investigated further, he found an old Polaroid camera. Under the camera were neat stacks of extremely low quality pictures. Pictures of my father in bed sleeping. That's when he noped the fuck out of there, taking the pictures with him straight to the police station. He moved out of that apartment shortly after, and he later heard that this same landlord had scared other residents of the apartment off after they heard the odd screeching, opera music, and after seeing all of their things moved around. The building my dad lived in has since been torn down. We learned this when he tried to show it to me on Google Earth. My dad never heard ultimately what happened to that landlord, only that it was likely that he'd be facing some jail time in the late 80s or early 90s. I seriously hope that man, that creep, was never allowed to be a landlord ever again.